In this video, my partner Alnor Maharali will be talking to you about salary and compensation negotiations, and in particular the tips and tricks that first or second time negotiators can use to make better deals. This is an excerpt of a larger webinar he gave on August 21st, 2021.
What advice would you give to a young professional starting their career and negotiating a first or even second job offer?
Yeah, great question, Adila. Thanks for asking. I think it's definitely a bit of a different dynamic, and we can certainly talk about what that would be like later on in your career. But I'm actually going to present a 4-part framework that works in both situations, but we'll certainly talk about the nuances between an early career offer versus a late career offer. And I want to start by saying that money is important. We're definitely not going to ignore that. This is a talk on salary negotiation, and I definitely want to talk about salary. But I'm also going to get us to try to think about compensation a little bit more holistically. And I want us to think about the value of an offer a bit more holistically than just the money. But if the money is what's important to you, we're going to talk about how you can get that too. The reason why this approach is considered, especially earlier in your career, is because the research shows that if you can look at the scope of the role, and if you can negotiate on the scope of the role, rather than just fixating on the money that the role is offering, it's more likely to yield longer term benefits. I'm sure a lot of people want money now, but if you can get some money now, but a lot of money later, that potentially could be more appealing than a good amount of money now. But once again, if your interest is that you have bills to pay and you need that money, then we can certainly negotiate for that too. But it's really important to research, to really focus on the scope of the role, and that can yield much better results.
So when you say the scope of the role, you're talking about the current role and where it may go in the future as well, or
Yes.
Just the current role, or what are your chances of moving up within the company?
Well, I feel like you read my mind, because this actually leads very cleanly into the first part of the 4-part framework. And
Okay.
I'm going to run through the 4 parts of the framework, and then I'm happy to have a discussion to go in depth on either of them. But
Okay.
The 4 steps that we advocate for people to approach a salary negotiation, and I'll list them off first and then talk about them individually, is first and foremost, as I think you were just alluding to, Nabila, is to start with your career goals and then map backwards. The second step is to understand what you're negotiating for. The third step is to reduce ambiguity about what, whom, and what, how, and with whom you're negotiating. Mm-hmm. And the last step of the framework is to aim to enhance your negotiations through relationships and to enhance your relationships through negotiations. And just so I can give credit where credit is due, this is not a framework that I myself developed, but one that's come out of a significant amount of research out of the Harvard Kennedy School, and specifically senior lecturer Hannah Riley Bowles.
So do you think, for the people listening, if we can list those 4 parts of the approach again, and do you think we can give examples of the 4 parts just so everybody's understanding it in the same way?
Yeah, I'd love that. And of course, if anything is not clear, please feel free to throw questions in the chat and we'll make sure that we answer them.
Yep.
So like I said, I also want to mention that this is not necessarily a linear process. It seems to naturally flow in the way that I'll present it, but more often than not, you're going to probably jump back and forth between some of these steps. I also want to flag that this can be somewhat of a lengthy process, but at the end of the day, if we're talking about negotiating your salary and your career trajectory, I think that's the kind of thing I would imagine that you would want to put some amount of time into.
Right, for sure. I think a lot of times, especially as young professionals, we get so excited at just having an offer that we forget to necessarily sit back and say that exactly what you were saying was, maybe I'm worth more. Just because I don't have previous job experience doesn't necessarily mean that I should settle for whatever. It's having that honest conversation with yourself as to what value do you really provide to the organization you're about to join. So
definitely. In my perspective, and what I've seen is that most people tend to undervalue themselves, or they may think that, I'm just one of, 20 people that's applying. If I even ask for anything, they're going to move on to the other person. And that's not always the case. And what I want people to start to become more comfortable with is asking for these things, but we're going to talk about how you can ask for it in such a way that it doesn't mean that they're going to storm off or rescind their offer. I want to get people to the point where they may receive a no on what they're asking for, and that's okay.
Absolutely. I remember my first experience getting into pharma. They presented an offer. I went back, but then I started freaking out that they were just going to take the offer away. And my HR colleague said, you never take the first offer.
Yeah. And I mean, there are exceptions to every rule, and I want to get into that too. But I think you flag an interesting point that the time element can also be very challenging for most people. First of all, waiting for that first offer can be excruciating. I've been there before. And then second of all, if you do make a counteroffer, waiting for them to get back to you can also be very difficult. But like I said, I want people to start to become comfortable with this framework, and hopefully they'll feel more comfortable asking going forward.
All right, so should we dive into an example?
Yeah, let's do it. So like I said, the very first step, and actually what I think is the most important step when looking at negotiating salary, especially earlier in your career, but also for later on, is to really take a second to step back and look at what your career goals are. And I mean, I know you mentioned how sometimes when you get that offer, it can be very exciting. And one of the common themes we're going to talk about today is how important preparation is. So before you even get that first offer, before maybe even you start applying for jobs, it's important to have this discussion with yourself or even with mentors on what your career goals are. So for example, if throughout undergrad, throughout college, you did internships in one field and then you're deciding to pivot to another field, you may have a better offer for the field that you interned in because you have some experience, and they may be offering you more compensation. And if compensation is what you need now, then maybe that's the offer that you want to consider. But for example, if you're trying to pivot to a whole other field and you have less experience, that may offer a lower salary now, but give you greater career satisfaction and greater compensation later. So if you can figure out kind of like, where do you want to be in 5 years? Where do you want to be in 10 years? When I say where you want to be, I'm not just talking about specifically career goals. I want us to look at, once again, the big picture. What is the work-life balance that you want? What is the mobility that you want? Do you want to work from home? Do you want to travel? Do you expect to have kids at some point? There's a lot of different questions that we can ask, and ultimately you need to figure out where you want to be, and then, like I said, map backwards to figure out what's the best thing for you right now.
Okay.
So that's step one of the framework.
Okay.
The second step, as I mentioned, was to understand what you're negotiating for. So generally speaking, salary negotiations tend to fall into one of three buckets. And these three are asking, bending, and shaping. And I'm going to tell you what those are. So asking is more of a standard situation where you're asking for something that would be normal for someone in your role. It's a role that you've done, and you're looking for a salary more in line with what other people in that role have done. So in that situation, if they made you an offer less than you think someone in this role should be making, you need to show them that it's reasonable because it fits within existing practices or norms. That's what we would call an asking negotiation. A bending negotiation is when you're asking the organization to make an exception for you. And that would be contrary to company practice, and they're just doing it for you. So in this case, it can be a little bit risky. There's a higher chance they could say no, but you really have to justify the ask. And you also really want to think of all the reasons they could say no, and then think of counterexamples that could hopefully help them come in line with you. And then the third one is called a shaping negotiation. And this is where ultimately you're not just making an ask that could impact you, but the entire company. This is something that could lead to an entirely new initiative or something that could change company policy. So for example, at the beginning of the pandemic, if you were asking for the ability to work from home and the end result was that every employee at that company would be eligible to work from home, that's what we could call a shaping negotiation. And we've seen that these require a lot more preparation and buy-in from multiple parties, and maybe even support from allies through the negotiation process. So ultimately, the approach that you take will depend on whether or not it's an ask, a bend, or a shape.
Okay. So is that step two?
That's step two.
Okay.
Step three, I think, is actually probably one of the most important steps. And this is the one about reducing the ambiguity about what, how, and with whom you're negotiating. And ultimately, what this boils down to is preparation, preparation, preparation. Like I said, most of us are not really taught how to negotiate, which is a challenge in itself. But I think as a result, most of us don't even know how to prepare for a negotiation, and, which is interesting because, we definitely prepared for that interview, right? We talked to some people, we did some research, we made some responses. But because of the fact that not a lot of us have that comfort with asking for things, or we're never trained how to properly negotiate, we don't know how to prepare. So you want to start asking yourself the kinds of questions like, what is negotiable? Who am I negotiating with? Who is the decision maker? And what is the type of negotiating that I'm getting into? And these are the kind of things that you can get from websites like Glassdoor and Indeed and LinkedIn. You can talk to people that have worked at the company. You can talk to mentors. You can talk to friends. You can look online. The point is for most things in life that are this important, we do a lot of research. We should be doing that same level of research for negotiation.
Very true. Very true. And then there's one more step, and then I'll get to a question from the chat box.
Yeah, perfect. And the final step is to really think about how can you enhance the negotiation through relationships, and how can you enhance your relationships through negotiation. So in the first part, this is about, once again, similar to step 3, but really trying to figure out who do you have within your network that could provide information? Who do you have in your network that could provide advice? Who can support you through this process? Or even do you know anyone even in the company, and maybe this is more for later on, that can advocate for you? So you really want to kind of look at the relationships that you have currently and see in what way can those support the negotiation. And then the second part of it is, how can you use this negotiation to enhance your relationship? And that means, and we're going to talk about this specifically, this comes back to that interest-based negotiation. If you have an interest in the negotiation, so do they. And is there a way for you to negotiate with the other party, either in general or specifically in salary, that can lead to an outcome that is mutually beneficial for both parties?
Okay. So these 4 steps that you mentioned, is it the same for if you're later in your career, or does the approach change?
So I would definitely advocate for this as kind of like the starting framework. Certainly the career goals may shift a little bit later. You might be more settled. You may be less kind of concerned with, advancement or other things. But for the most part, the framework can apply across the board, but we can talk about some differences that may exist for later in your career.
Okay, so let's do that. Let's talk about some nuances that may exist if you're starting or if you're later more established. But because we said we were going to keep this interactive, I'm going to go to the chat box, and we have 2 questions. I'm going to read them here. So the first question is, what if you gave, and I'm sorry, I don't know what this acronym means, an RTR? Are you familiar with what that means?
I'm not sure, but I can Google it, or hopefully the person can put it in the chat.
Okay, so what if you're given an RTR, you gave an RTR to a recruiter at a certain salary and certain benefits, and you're offered for that role, but they come back at a lower salary or some different salary, but different benefits? How do you renegotiate the salary? Or if you have a competing offer, but you really want to join this first company, what would you do? And right to represent is what RTR means.
Okay, I feel like there's 2 questions there, so maybe we can take them one at a time.
Okay.
So can you repeat the first question, Nabila?
So the first part is, if you gave a right to represent to a recruiter at a certain salary and certain benefits, that if you were to be offered the role, but they came back with a lower salary or some other salary and different benefits, how do you go back to renegotiate?
Perfect. Yeah. So let's deal with that first. I'm actually unfortunately not familiar with the RTR term. My background's in negotiation, a little less in HR, but I think we can definitely answer this question. So
I'm assuming it means that you've just given, it says you've given consent to the recruiter to submit your profile and do some of that negotiation for you.
Got it. Okay. That's perfect. Okay. And I'm actually kind of really glad someone asked this question, because if they hadn't, I was going to talk about it anyway. So someone's reading my mind. I think it's fair to say that it's not uncommon for when you're negotiating salary for one offer or subsequent offers to come in a little bit lower than you expect. First and foremost, I want people to be comfortable. If you feel that, well, let me backtrack a bit. Sorry, I apologize. First of all, it's important to make sure that you know your value, that, what you're expecting for yourself, is it fair? And to do a bit of research, once again, like I said, is this the industry standard? Or, are you asking for a lot more money than could normally be expected in this role? Or, could normally be offered for this role in that company? Just because the company has offered a standard pay, it doesn't mean that you can't negotiate. And I also definitely want to have a conversation about looking at compensation a bit more holistically, because like I said, there is more to the offer than just salary, both in terms of the role itself, but also in terms of things like benefits and vacation and et cetera. And we can talk about that too, but it is important to look at the whole package holistically. But if we're just talking about salary and the number comes in a little bit lower than you expected, and it satisfies those two criteria where it's not unfair to ask for more based on industry standards and not unfair to ask for more based on the value that you're bringing to the position, first and foremost, I want people to come back and ask. I don't want people to feel uncomfortable thinking that they can't ask. As I said earlier, the key is if you frame it in such a way, the worst case scenario, and this is in my mind, is that they'll just say no. I still think that most people think the worst case scenario is they're going to kind of laugh in your face and rescind the offer and you'll be left with nothing. From my experience, that doesn't happen very often. And if we really kind of focus on the way that we respond to the request, it's less likely to happen. So the way that I would respond to that is, you want to show your excitement for the position. So you can go back to them and say, listen, I'm very excited about the position. It shows you're interested. I think I'd be a right fit for the team. It shows your value. I'm excited. I bring a lot of value. And then you can kind of, gently come in and not saying I demand, but I'm wondering if we can explore a slightly higher or a higher starting salary of X. And that's where you can kind of put the ask in. And then you want to come in with justification. My market research shows the industry average for this area, and I'm confident that you'll be very happy with how much I can contribute to the team. So once again, it's that frame, right? You're showing that you're a collaborator, but you're showing that, you're comfortable with your value and you really want to work for them, but you're just trying to see if a higher salary is possible.
So I would assume there's some people taking notes right now. So if you can basically make a statement, I'm sure some people will write it down and then fill in the blanks for their own situation, but a really nice way or a very tactful way of saying, I think you've come in lower and I would expect blah, blah, blah.
Bingo, yeah.
So how would you say it?
Yeah, so I would say, thank you for the offer. I'm very excited about the position. I feel that I would be a great fit for the team and that I'd bring a lot of value to the position based on my experience. I'm wondering if we can explore a higher salary of X. This is where you fill in your number. My market research shows that shows this as the industry average for this particular role. And I'm confident that you'll be very happy with how much I can contribute to the team and to the company. Something along those lines. Like you can tweak this a bit, but the point is that you're showing them that you're interested and you're not demanding anything, but you're just seeing what's possible.
Right. You just want to see if there's room for discussion.
Yeah. And you're also restating your value, which is also key.
Okay. So restating value. Okay.
Now, sorry, just quickly, if they still say no, I still wouldn't necessarily give up. So if I can give kind of a follow-up, if they still say no, they probably would come back with a reason, like so they may say, this is all we pay starting people or any other reason they come back with. It's important to acknowledge that in any negotiation, the number one thing I've come to realize is you really want to make sure the other person feels heard. So I would start with a response, I understand, and this is where you'd fill in whatever concern they raised. I would like to be as flexible as possible so that I can work with your team. I'm still very excited about joining your group. Would it be possible? I would like to explore whether X, fill in the blank again, is possible given my specific experience and skill set. And then I would follow that up with, is there anything else besides compensation that could take into account my experience and skill set? And this opens the door for them to offer something else besides just salary that could potentially satisfy you.
So when you say something else, you're talking about potentially maybe a signing bonus, extra vacation, working from home, things like that, right?
Yeah, I mean, they may be willing to pay for education. They may be willing to put you on a fast track for promotion. This is where I'm saying is there's a world of possibility outside salary like I said, I don't want to ignore the money, but there's
Right.
so much that you can negotiate in a job offer.
Okay. I know there was a part 2 to this question, but I'm going to skip to this other question to make sure everybody's getting something in. What if your salary is already at a higher end of the band or above average? Is it okay to renegotiate, or is it okay to negotiate in this instance? You know, oftentimes the first thing you said, well, you're already at the higher end of the band. That's a very common thing that we hear anytime we even ask for something more, higher end of the band. So how would you approach that?
I mean, I think I would, well, once again, I would start by having to know for myself what was the reason. Well, you know, like it's important to be comfortable with yourself, you know, why you're asking for the more salary. And once again, is if this is what you need to pay the bills or to maintain a certain quality of life, or you have 2 kids going to college, I think it's important to know internally why. Not to say that you always need to share with the employer. I definitely wouldn't go into a job interview and say, I need to make a lot of money because I have massive amounts of debt. I'm not going into any negotiation saying anything like that. So it's important, first of all, to be comfortable with yourself as to why you're asking. And then really it's a question of, and we're going to talk about this as well, you know, how much do you need that extra money? And what would you do if you're not going to get it? This is something we call alternatives in negotiation parlance. But, you know, I think if this is something that you feel you deserve, and you feel like you have a rationale for it, like I still think you need to justify the ask. So if you're at the top end of the band, and you know, or the top end of the industry standard, I would really want to feel like, you know, I've just completed some incredible project, or I've brought a ton of new value to the company. Otherwise, I think if you don't have a good enough reason, it's difficult to justify that.
This question is really interesting. Can you discuss negotiating a counteroffer from a current employer that is a result of you giving notice that you're going to leave for another company? How would you think about your worth to the company when they don't give you promotions or comp increases until you're ready to leave?
I mean, I would say that, I mean, I think there's, you know, it's not uncommon for people to take that personally. I can't say that I wouldn't either, but I think the challenge is, at the end of the day, they're a company, right? And I have to imagine if I'm running a company, I'm trying to make as much money as possible. Now, you know, in terms of, that's a whole different, I think, IP and webinar about how to make money. And I think happy employees is a big part of that, but it's certainly not uncommon for, you know, I don't know many companies that are going around offering unsolicited bonuses or unsolicited raises. And actually, one of the points I really wanted to make today is, if you're sitting around waiting for your company to notice you and to offer you a higher salary, I think that's a mistake. I think if you feel like you deserve a higher salary, you have to be the one to go after it yourself. And I really want people to start thinking of negotiation not as kind of begging or asking for money, but self-advocacy. So if you think you're worth it, and timing, of course, is a big part of that, you really should be considering it. So I wouldn't necessarily be insulted if that was kind of the case. But if I was to if I was to kind of be thinking of going somewhere else, I'd also be wondering if I could leverage that. And are there any circumstances under which I would stay with that company? Because one of the best times to negotiate is when you have an incredible alternative. And if you already have another offer in hand that you're willing to take, you have nothing to lose by negotiating with the person you're currently with. The only thing I would say is I would still do it personally in a very polite and courteous way. You know, I wouldn't be aggressive about it. I wouldn't kind of, you know, like I'd be sincere about it.
Yes.
And then, you know, who knows what might happen. And I'd really want to think through, like, if you're going to kind of come in and thinking they could make a counteroffer to you, I'd also want to anticipate what I might do if they do that. Because I think ultimately you probably need references from these people, or they may still be in the same industry. So
True.
I really try to focus on the relationship aspect of that.
Without burning a bridge. Yes, yes.
Bingo.
Okay. So I'm going to take one more question from the chat, and then we'll go back to some of the points you want to make sure you touch on.
Sure.
How do you handle a situation where the interviewer asks you your current salary during an interview?
So that's a tough one. I've definitely been there before. But my understanding is that it's in some states, I believe, it's no longer allowed
Right.
to ask that question. So it's certainly one, I know it can certainly be difficult. I think one of the ways that I might try to approach something like that is, the current role that I am, I believe, is somewhat different than the role that we're asking for. So I'm not sure that that would be a relevant reference point to this current role. They may still press, but that question also makes me a little bit uncomfortable. So, but I think it can be difficult because one of the challenges in negotiation, as I think this person is aptly pointing out, is as soon as you give that number, that's going to be what's called an anchor. And, there's a good chance that all future numbers are going to try to be as close to that number as possible. So I would try to be as tactful as possible, but try to avoid answering the question.
Right. But I mean, if you're currently at a certain salary, you're not going to jump ship for anything less than where you are, I would assume.
Yeah. In that
unless that total compensation package is absolutely stellar, right? So
yes. And that's kind of how I would also answer the question. And I'm glad you pointed that out, is to say, whatever offer, if an offer was to come from this company, I would look at it holistically again, in terms of the broader compensation. But yeah, you're right that in terms of if you know for a fact, and once again, I want people to know these things ahead of time. If you know for a fact that you won't take anything less than what you're currently making, it could certainly be helpful in that regard. But once again, you'd also want to do the research in terms of if you also know that the place you're coming generally pays more than you're currently making, then I would feel uncomfortable having that as an anchor. But if it's like, into similar industries, similar salaries, and you want to make sure you're going to make at least as much as you're making currently, in that case, it could be helpful to share it.
Okay. All right. Well, let's get back to our outline a bit, and we are going to do our best to come back to some of the questions that are in the chat. Now, we talked about the 4 parts of negotiation, how they are for early on in your career versus later on in your career. Let's see. When's the best time to negotiate? And how do you know whether or not something even is negotiable?
Yeah, so that's certainly very tricky. I think once again, it does depend a little bit on whether this is earlier in your career or later in your career, and at what stage in the hiring process you are.
Okay.
For earlier in your career, I definitely don't start to get too specific about negotiating salary until unless you have an offer in hand. I think that's super important, because if you start to negotiate too early, there is a chance that they may think, well, it's a lot easier for them just to kick you out of the process, versus once they've made you an offer, there's already a bit of an emotional attachment, an emotional commitment, I think, to you. They started to think about a universe where you could be working for them. They're a bit more committed. And at that point, it's a little bit easier to negotiate. And I also want people to come in with a clear value proposition at this point too. They really need to know what they're worth and how that compares to the industry standard. So that's kind of, in terms of earlier in your career, I would normally wait until I receive the offer. It's not uncommon to have discussions about salary before that. And we can talk about that a little bit too, in terms of what do you do if you're asked what your salary expectations are during the process?
Yes.
So we can have that conversation too. In terms of if you've been with the company for a while, I think most importantly, you have to take the company context into play. Like, are they downsizing? Are they expanding? Are there new ventures? You really kind of want to make sure you're cognizant of stuff like that. What's the lay of the land with the company that you're in? Once again, it's important to know your value proposition. Generally speaking, performance reviews can be a good time to at least have that discussion. And I think one of the biggest challenges a lot of people face in general is they don't like to be surprised by these kinds of things. So, if I had a performance review coming up, I might say, and additionally, I would appreciate the opportunity to have a conversation about my compensation package as part of the performance review. Hopefully you're anticipating and do receive a positive review. I know sometimes they can go in opposite directions, but performance reviews can be a good time to have that discussion, or after the completion of a major project or major deliverable. That's a good time to kind of flag your worth. And then lastly, as I mentioned earlier, I definitely feel like you have to be proactive about this kind of thing. You can't wait to be noticed. The third special case that we just talked about was when you have nothing to lose. So if you've received an offer for another company that you're more than happy to take, I would definitely have that discussion. But like I said, only if there was a universe where you could consider staying with your company for the right compensation package. I wouldn't waste their time if there was no chance at all of you accepting whatever offer they might give you.
Okay. And then what if you've already accepted an offer that's given to you, but then you want to, after that offer, go back and negotiate something else in your compensation package, like PTO, paid time off? Would it be okay to open that negotiation after you've accepted a salary offer, or should you not?
I mean, I think it probably could be content specific, but for the most part, I really feel like you should not accept an offer until you've negotiated everything that you want. And it's generally viewed as bad form once you've agreed to something to try to reopen it. So, ultimately people should do whatever they're comfortable with. But that's the situation that I normally avoid. Also, I've spoken to a few HR professionals about this on the HR side. And I apologize if this comes across as naive, but all the HR professionals I've spoken to have told me that, they also have policies and they're not in a position, they're not supposed to lie. So when a company says this is their best and final offer, I normally take that as face value. And then, I try to decide, is that good enough for me? Ultimately, if you're going to turn down if their best offer is not good enough for you, once again, it doesn't hurt to ask, because you're going to turn out anyway. Then what the worst thing they can do is say no, and then you're still not going to take the job. And then I also wouldn't normally ask, once again, the opposite side of it, if the company's just gone through like a restructuring or downsizing, or you're in a recession, maybe not the best time to negotiate salary. But once again, if you have great alternatives, then that opens up a door of possibilities.
Right. We're in a very interesting time right now, too, with the pandemic, right? So I don't know, like I said, an interesting time. Do you do it? Do you not do it? Do you wait for things to settle down a little bit more? I guess it's industry dependent right now. I could imagine, if you're a nurse or something, the healthcare space right now would be a great time for you to negotiate because they're short staffed versus another industry, maybe. Yeah,
definitely. But like I said, the number one thing that I would look at when I'm negotiating is, do I have a good alternative? And because alternatives are sources of power. So if you can have another offer in hand, that certainly strengthens your position. And then whether or not you disclose that is, once again, up to you. It can be helpful sometimes, but once again, I would do it in the most courteous way possible. And I'm not saying that, I'm advocating for a certain approach. There are other approaches that probably work some of the time. I'm advocating for the approach that I would want people to take. And, that's the fair, honest, courteous approach. But once again, that doesn't mean you can't defend yourself. You can't be firm. You can't be direct. You can do all those things, but you don't have to kind of like yell or threaten or scream either.
Right. More collaborative a more collaborative approach to getting what you want.
Yeah.
I think you started out with it early on was, you said, is there room to discuss this? This is what I feel. Are you open to discussing it? Versus, this is what I feel. Do this or I'm out.
Bingo. Exactly. Is there wiggle room? That's the kind of we could also ask. I did quickly want to circle back just a few more things I wanted to add about kind of mid or later career. The number one thing I would tell people as you get into your careers is really make sure you track your accomplishments, because it doesn't mean that you have to brag every time you have a salary negotiation, but once again, it's so important to know what you're worth. And I think most of us undervalue what we can do for a company. So it's good to track all the major projects you did, all the major initiatives you've done, all the value you've brought to that company. I think later on in your career, there's a bit more wiggle room, because I think that for a certain extent, there is a cost for them to lose you, right? If you ask for more money and they say they can't do it and you ultimately walk, they have to bring on a new person or promote from within, but there's a cost to them there. So there is a value. I feel you have a little bit more leverage the more you get into your career. And I also think that for the most part, employees, for the most part, want their employers want their employees to be happy. And you probably want to work for companies who want you to be happy. So they'll want to make sure that you're getting a fair salary. And of course, fair can be defined in many different ways. But for the most part, I do think you have a bit more leverage. In terms of just negotiating in general, like I said, the key thing really is there's a few different elements we try to look at. So alternatives I've talked about, Can you create options together? But really the key thing for me is interests. And just if I can share a very quick story, I was actually doing some consulting work for a small business here in New York. So I've actually coached on both sides of this, both to the employee and the employers.
Okay.
And this employer, their COO had come in a bit unexpectedly and had asked for a bunch of different compensation changes to their package. And this employer approached me because they were actually taken aback, and I could almost say even offended that this person had come at it this way, and they didn't really know what to do. And I gave them some very simple advice. I said, listen, have a conversation with them, try to understand the why, the interest behind everything they're asking for, and don't promise anything in that first conversation. Just go in completely hoping to listen. And they did that. And it turned out that, the reason why this employee was asking for so many things was it wasn't because they thought that they were great and that they were threatening to walk. They actually were insecure, and they felt they needed more assurances that they could have a long-lasting career with this company.
Interesting.
And if this employer hadn't kind of asked, why is this important to you? Whole thing could have fallen apart. And instead, they've renegotiated their contract, and both sides are a lot happier.
Interesting. Again, the why, right? That's, as you said, right when we started, the why is critical for both sides to know, for you to understand their why and them to understand your why.
Yeah, it's not like vowels. It's not sometimes why, it's always why.
Always. Funny. So we do have more questions, but there is one question that I want to get to. What are your perspectives on the impact of gender in negotiation, and the approaches? Are the approaches different based on gender even? And I know this question can go in many ways and probably take a long time, but we are at the 10-minute mark. So if you can just kind of touch on your thoughts, and then we'll go back to a few questions before we wrap up.
Yeah, that sounds great. This is a really important question. And the short answer is, sadly, yes, there is a difference. And I want to talk about some of that, but also some strategies to mitigate that. And once again, there's a lot of significant research that's been done on this by Professor Hannah Riley Bowles at the Harvard Kennedy School. So that's where I've gotten a lot of my findings from. So there has been research done on this, and a lot of us know about the wage-gender gap, but the studies actually show that the disparity in salary between what women and men receive is less about the fact that women aren't negotiating as much as men, but that it's not that they're making less money, but it's that they're not negotiating as much. It's more about their career trajectory. So it's not that they're making less money for the same job. They're not doing a good enough job of advocating for their careers and ending up with a lower trajectory. And what's interesting is it's actually been shown that statistically speaking, women have a harder time advocating for themselves, but are actually excellent at advocating for others. And what's interesting is I actually also fall into that demographic too. When I first started negotiating, I also, like I said, it's not just everyone. This is me too, although I've improved a lot, obviously. But a lot of people have a hard time with this. So as I said, the key really in this is it's really important for everyone, but women especially, to focus on the trajectory part of the negotiation and the holistic package and the opportunity for career advancement, but also the salary. It turns out that there actually is an unfortunate double standard. Statistics show that for women, the social costs of negotiation are much higher. They are perceived more negatively. And it has been shown that people want to work with women less who negotiate with them than for a man who negotiates. And I do find that unfortunate. What that means, though, is that when women approach negotiations, they may want to take a slightly different approach. So Sheryl Sandberg from Facebook, in her book Lean In, she talks about an approach called Think I, Talk We. And this is kind of the approach that women should potentially use is when you have the conversation, be clear about what you want and why it's important to you. But in that negotiation, also really work hard to help the other side understand why you're of value to them and the value that you're going to bring to the company.
Okay. Again, like I said, we can only get to the tip of the iceberg on this question, I think. But, just you validating the statistics that do go behind showing negotiations are generally tougher for women. is good. And I'm sure if there is more discussion that needs to take place about this, that I know you're going to give out your contact at the end. Alicia, I think there's somebody in the chat wanted the name of the book again, and it's Lean In by Sheryl Sandberg, right?
That's the one, yeah.
Yep. Okay. Let's see. Do you have any final tips or thoughts before we open it up for maybe 2 more questions before we close?
Yeah, I know that one of the common questions that I've received is what to do if you're in kind of a first or second interview and you get the question about what are your expectations for this role. So if I can very quickly touch upon that, as I mentioned, there is this concept in negotiation called anchoring, where whoever puts out the first number, the final number tends to be around that. I think the risk people often feel is if I put out a number, if it's too high, I'm going to offend them. And if it's too low, I'm going to be stuck with it. So, there are certain times when anchoring and salary negotiation can be helpful. But once again, your preparation and research are critical. So, the main approach I like to take to salary expectation questions are an interest-based approach, not surprisingly. So I'm looking for an opportunity to prove my worth, or I'm looking for a fair salary by industry standards. But for example, if I can just kind of give a few more kind of responses people can use if they are given these questions. So the first thing I would say is I would need to, so once again, I try not to answer it right away, especially earlier on, because you want to leave the door open as much as possible. So I would need to know quite a bit more about the details of the role before I can give you an accurate answer. Now, if they push again, the second thing I would say is, I imagine there is an approved salary range. Are you in a position to share this with me? So, once again, from a place of inquiry, a place of curiosity, but you're not being too forceful. And then if they ask again, there's actually mixed views on this, what to do in the third time. Some people advocate for a range and some people advocate for not. Once again, it depends on the context. The challenge with a range, obviously, is that if you give a range, there's a chance they could be more likely to go to the lower end. So really kind of, if I really don't want to say or I'm uncomfortable saying, once again, I take this approach of compensation holistically. So while compensation is important to me, I want to look at the entire value of working at your company, and I'm excited to learn more, after which I'll have a better idea of what I might expect. And like I said, we've talked about this already, but compensation holistically means things like benefits, vacation, work culture, career advancement, training and development. There's so many different aspects to ways you can get value from a company beyond just salary.
Thanks for watching. And a special thanks to Professor Hannah Riley Bowles at the Harvard Negotiation Project for her great work on this topic. If you liked the video, please hit the like button. And for more of our content, hit the subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Also, how do you feel about the longer form content? Let us know. If you like these kind of videos, maybe we'll make more of them. If you prefer to keep it on the shorter side, let us know in the comments as well. From Venn Mediation, thank you so much for tuning in. We're here to help, and we hope to see you soon.